Welcome, everyone. The webinar will begin shortly. We invite you to connect with the campaign for grade level reading on social media. Use hashtag Learning Tuesdays and tag us to tweet anything you learn from today's webinar, and we'll be sure to retweet. The webinar will begin shortly. It will be recorded and shared with you afterward. Okay, once again, welcome to today's conversation. My name is Sierra Sanchez, and I will be behind the scenes helping to produce this webinar. I have just a few housekeeping details before we get started. First, we would love for you to introduce yourself in the chat box at the bottom of the screen. We also encourage you to post any questions you may have in the Q&A box, as we'll be dedicating some time to answer those questions. This webinar is being recorded and live streamed on Facebook. A link to the recording, as well as the slides and any resources shared in the chat, will be emailed in a follow-up email to all webinar registrants. And finally, we'll be posting a brief on-screen evaluation during Q&A and highly encourage you to respond. Before we begin, I would like to turn your attention to our upcoming webinars. Next week at 3 p.m., we invite you to join us for a session on identifying and advancing initiatives to accelerate learning recovery. The following week, Election Day, November 8th, we will not be having any sessions on Zoom, but we will be having special rebroadcast sessions on our YouTube channel. We do encourage you to take that time on that day to vote in your local elections. And finally, on November 15th, we invite you to a Funder to Funder conversation co-sponsored by Overdeck Family Foundation. Registration and more information for these webinars will be posted in the chat box now, and we hope you can join us. Joining you now is Hillary Jones with Foundations, Inc. Thank you and enjoy the webinar.
Thank you, Sierra. It is a pleasure to be here with each of you today. Welcome. Thank you for taking your time to learn a little bit about this special year of kindergarten. It's an important year, and today we're going to talk about why. We're going to hear from some experts who are going to share the areas that teachers and decision makers should be focusing on as they talk about educating the whole child and making this a transitional year an important year. I have the pleasure to introduce our moderator for today's session, Laura. Laura Bornford is a senior fellow and advisor on early and elementary education with the Education Policy Program at New America. Laura focuses on transforming kindergarten and promoting policy and practice that will strengthen the transition into kindergarten and the early grades of elementary school. Before joining New America, over 7 years ago, Laura worked with several policy organizations in Washington, D.C., including the Institute for Educational Leadership and the Forum for Education and Democracy. Laura also helped implement youth programs for the city of Orlando and was a fourth grade teacher. So welcome, Laura. Thank you for spending time with us today.
Thank you, Hillary, and thank you to everyone joining us today for an important discussion about kindergarten. I'm going to begin with some context for this webinar and share why New America and the Campaign for Grade Level Reading are partnering on a webinar series about kindergarten. Then I will introduce our panelists, whom you'll hear from a little later. And lastly, I'll introduce and have a chat with Swati Adarkar from the Department of Education to learn more about the work she's doing in her role there. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. Over the years, when I have written or spoken about kindergarten, I have often talked about it being largely undervalued for just how important a year it is for children's development, learning, and long-term educational success. I think it is undervalued for a few reasons. One, so much of state and district officials' energy is on third grade and up. Two, there is some confusion about what the real purpose of the kindergarten year actually is. And three, it looks very different and more different than other grades, depending on where you live. Because of the COVID pandemic, kindergarten and the early grades are getting more attention, and some states are expanding kindergarten offerings and requirements and investing more in early learning, but there is still a long way to go. According to a scan by the Education Commission of the States in 2020, when we look at kindergarten across the country, only 19 states and DC require that children attend kindergarten. Only 17 states and DC require full-day kindergarten to be offered. 39 require districts to offer either half or full day. Some states allow districts to charge tuition for a full day of kindergarten, and in many states, kindergarten is funded at a lower level than first grade. And when kindergarten is a full day, the length of the day isn't always equivalent to first grade. It could be as little as 2.5 hours. In some states, families can skip kindergarten altogether and children begin their education with first grade. And because of how K is structured in many places, it can be unintentionally seen as less important, and children's attendance can reflect this. Next slide, please. At one time, children in kindergarten played to learn much of the school day. They explored, they made friends, they had conversations. But in the last few decades, the pendulum has swung almost entirely in the opposite direction. Kindergartners spend much more of their days in rote instruction, in reading and math, with limited options for choice, exploration, and play. Research in the last decade shows how kindergarten has changed, with some asking if kindergarten is the new first grade. In 2016, researchers published a study with that title, showing kindergartners were exposed to more reading and math content in 2010 than in 1998. Many groups have lamented the shifts in kindergarten, especially since the standard movement in the 90s and No Child Left Behind in the 2000s. And in focus groups with principals that New America did back in 2015, several principals noted district officials in the mid-2000s telling them to remove the kitchens from kinder classrooms. There's no time for play. On the contrary, there's always time for play, relationship building, and back and forth interactions. And in fact, children learn better with those things and through them than without. It's true that over the years, kindergartners are seeing more math and reading, but is this necessarily a bad thing? Next slide, please. Next slide. No, but with all things, implementation and delivery matters. Reading shouldn't crowd out science, math, and opportunities for children to learn about the world around them. In fact, building background knowledge and vocabulary is important for being strong readers and learners. And when looking at what's happening in classrooms, I'd hope to see less of what you see on the left side of this slide to more engaging learning, even engaging learning with reading, math, and all of the other content areas. Play is learning, and through guided play exploration, relationships, conversations, teachers can transform learning for children from something teacher-directed and constrained to something engaging and interactive and much more meaningful and impactful. Next slide, please. Because of the important role that kindergarten plays in students' education, and because of the need to think about how to transform it in a meaningful way, New America and the Campaign for Grade Level Reading are collaborating on a series of webinars. This series, which starts today on transforming kindergarten, will continue through January and maybe longer. Our next sessions will be on November 29th, and that'll be play, relationships, and academics, teaching in ways kindergartners learn best. And that'll bring together Nell Duke, Kathy Hirsch-Pasek, and Deb Leong, and educators. And then we have one in the works for December 13th. And that will focus more on policy and other state and local levers for change. Look for more details about those coming soon. Next slide, please. Or end the slides. Today, we'll hear more from experts on why kindergarten is such an important year and what states, districts, and schools can do differently to transform instruction environments and learning opportunities to ensure children are learning in the ways that are best for them. Let me introduce our experts for today's conversation. Ellen Galinsky, president of the Families and Work Institute and author of several books, including Mind in the Making and the forthcoming The Breakthrough Years. And also joining us today is Dr. Ryan Lee James, Chief Academic Officer of the Atlantis Speech School and Director of the Rollins Center for Language and Literacy. Welcome. We will hear from Ellen and Ryan in a few minutes. But first, I'm also thrilled to introduce Swati Adarkar, Deputy Assistant Secretary for Policy and Early Learning at the U.S. Department of Education. Prior to joining the department, Swati was National Policy Director for Start Early and was co-founder and president and CEO of the Children's Institute in Oregon for 15 years. You can read more about all of our panelists on the bio sheet, but we'll get started with Swati. Swati, welcome.
So great to be here, Laura. Thank you so much for the warm welcome.
Welcome.
I'd love to thank the campaign for grade level reading and New America for raising up the importance of kindergarten and launching this webinar series.
Thank you. Thank you. That's high praise coming from you. Let's start with your background and really how it is shaping your work at the department.
Well, as you mentioned before, a couple of my previous roles, I've had a chance to work at the state level on early learning policy and practice, most recently in Oregon, where I had a chance to work very closely with a couple school districts through an initiative called Early Works, an urban school district, sort of medium size, and then a small rural school district. And that really transformed my experience and thinking around policy to really have the chance to work with partners on the ground to think about how you build that seamless experience and the set of partnerships and funding streams that it takes. And it really inspired my thinking on the important role that schools play and districts as anchors of this work.
Great. And so now you've been at the department for about 5 months. You want to tell us about your early time there?
Sure. Well, I'm honored to have joined the department just this last May to lead the development and shaping of an early learning agenda. And I want to mention that I stand on the shoulders of amazing predecessors. First, Jacqueline Jones, then Libby Doggett and Miriam Calderon, who helped shape the work at the department before me. Having never worked in the federal government before, I can assure you that it's definitely been a learning curve. And I've enjoyed the process of working with really dedicated team members. And I'm really mindful. I'm in the Office of Elementary and Secondary Education, and that part of the department, as well as folks across the whole department, have been working at unbelievable pace and rate to respond to COVID and get resources out to state education agencies, which then are supporting districts. And I just am mindful at the limited capacity and bandwidth in which they've been doing this work and just appreciate what they've been doing. I'm also really honored to be part of a team that's advancing Secretary Cardona's vision to really focus on reducing disparities and lift up an equity agenda. And many of you may know about the early learning leadership he provided in Connecticut.
Yeah. So you spoke a little bit about some of the challenges facing the department with COVID and the resources needed to be directed to recovery, but what other opportunities and challenges have you seen? Certainly having a secretary who understands early learning has to be an important opportunity for your work.
That's a great question, Laura. When I arrived at the department, I did not know at that point what was the embrace and commitment or understanding of early learning. It's a big department. And I can tell you that 5 months in, I am delighted and incredibly encouraged to find this wide embrace of support and understanding of early learning and how it fits in an important part of the continuum. We're also very fortunate to have really experienced leaders of the Department of Education who have state and local experience. My boss in the Office of Elementary and Secondary Education, Dr. James Lane, was the state chief in Virginia. Our deputy secretary was the former superintendent in San Diego, working on a P3 strategy. And so it really helps that to this federal role, they're bringing state and local experience. And so I'm deeply appreciative of that. I'm also keenly aware as a political appointee coming in halfway through this first term of the Biden-Harris administration, that this work is happening on a short runway and that it's important to really think about how to make it actionable, focused, and fast-tracked, and to really think, therefore, about the existing tools, resources, and capacities that exist at the department. And these last 5 months, I've had a chance to be much more grounded in what those are.
Mm-hmm. And we'll get to talking a little bit more about those in just a moment. But first, I know that kindergarten has been a priority so far. And I wanted to just hear from you, why do you see kindergarten as an important year to focus on?
Well, I'm really appreciative that the department has embraced a pre-K third focus on this strategy. And we can think about kindergarten as part of that pre-K third focus as the sturdy bridge. And given the effect of the pandemic and the effect particularly on early learners and the early learning community, kindergarten serves as this important foundational point for both the look forward and the look back at the years before. And as somebody, I know many of the people on this webinar have been working really hard to increase access and quality and services in the years before kindergarten. One of the things that we often don't think about is that at this point in our state of public education, kindergarten is in fact the first universal access point to early learning. And I'm not sure we really acknowledge it as such. And when I think about what it's like for a kindergarten teacher to have maybe a smaller class of 22, but sometimes up to 30 students, what it's like for that one teacher in a classroom to think about welcoming, receiving, and having preparation to meet every one of those children when they arrive. And know what that set of experiences across a wide variety of early learning settings. We know there are all sorts of settings with parents, Head Start, early Head Start, home visiting, family friend and neighbor care, center-based childcare, a preschool special education classroom. And so a kindergarten experience would need to be informed about where children came from and what kinds of opportunities they had. In addition, we know that children have different developmental assets and strengths as they come, and children are across a span of development. Some children have had the chance to be screened for delays and learning differences and disabilities. Some haven't. Some have been screened but haven't had the benefit of those services. So these two realities underscore the importance of really assuring those supports, tools, and diagnostics for the kindergarten year to really lay a path for early school success.
What are your longer term goals and strategies for how the department can strengthen the early learning continuum?
Thanks for that question. We're really focusing on two important commitments. The first is to close that gap between the science of learning and the current state of practice today. We know that focusing on whole child approaches are evidence-based, and we know that too often, as you shared in your introduction, we don't think about how to support joyful and playful learning, social emotional development, and the strategies that would really support multilingual learners, and in essence, supporting developmentally appropriate practice. The second commitment has to do with transforming what are currently two risk-filled transitions into opportunity. We know across the continuum when children and students go from elementary to middle to high school that we often lose students during that period. And our youngest learners are often the most vulnerable in those transitions. So we have to think about how we can support early educators and early elementary teachers, once again, to build that sturdy bridge and have strong transitions that can inform developmentally appropriate practice into kindergarten and inform differentiated instruction into first grade.
Thank you, Swati. And I totally agree. And it's good to hear you talk about the importance of transition and connecting, kindergarten teachers connecting and coordinating with all of the various early learning center settings that children may experience before they enter kindergarten. And schools and kindergarten teachers, it's so important for them to be ready for whatever children come with. And that includes dual language learners who may or may not have been identified. And as you said, students with disabilities and other needs. And it's a tall order, but it's the foundation, for what future children's learning is built on.
Absolutely. I'd love to just say something about the internal and external strategies in order to advance those two commitments. The first, as I mentioned, is deploying the existing resources and assets at the department. And it's really important to think about the technical assistance as well as the grants. I think you're aware that last December, the department launched a kindergarten collaborative, which we're very excited about. WestEd is supporting a group of 15 states who've taken up the work, who I'm very appreciative of, to think about how to transform the kindergarten year. And so building on that kindergarten collaborative and the lessons learned through that collaborative is going to be really important. We have a chance to make sure we're supporting SEAs in this work, and that includes cross-agency work, and we work very closely with our partner, HHS, as well as the independent entity providing really abundant and important research, the Institute for Education Sciences, that launched a really important scope of work on pre-K third during the Obama administration. We also have a chance to engage external stakeholders, education organizations, parent-facing groups, philanthropy, research, early education partners, as we think about lifting up models, proof points, and exemplars. If we don't know about this work on the ground, we can't inform practice and policy. And I think the campaign and New America and others have done a great job of lifting up bright spots. But at the department, we're really interested in a partnership to really think about how we can tell those stories, because if we don't know about them, we can't benefit from what they're learning.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, thank you for joining us today. Thank you for your work so far at the department, and look forward to hearing more both today and in the future.
Thank you, Laura.
Thank you. And thank you also to Ellen and Ryan for joining me today. And, please turn on your cameras. And, I'm ready to jump in and have more of a deeper conversation about the kindergarten year.
Laura?
Yes.
Hi, this is Ryan.
Hi, Ryan.
I just want to say the host has disabled my camera. That's the message I'm getting. Sorry.
Oh, okay. Well, hopefully we can. Oh, you're back. All right. Ready to go. Okay, so we know that every grade is important in children's education, but what really makes kindergarten such a pivotal year. And Ellen, let's start with you.
Okay. Well, thank you. It's wonderful to be with all of you. And as you can see, I love Swati's notion of a sturdy bridge to a lifetime of learning. If we could go to the next slide. And it's going to say question 1, and she just asked it, so we can move to the second. Yeah, there we go. One of the reasons that kindergarten is so important is that it is a crucial time in the development of the brain connections that lead to executive function skills. And you're going to hear me talk a lot about that. We've tended to look at 0 to 3 and think that and understand how that's foundational, but we really need to pull back and start earlier. That is, we need to start in the prenatal period and thinking about learning and life and those sorts of things. And then we need to move beyond 0 to 3. And if we want to talk about the early foundational years, it needs to include the 4 and 5-year-olds, 3, 4, 5-year-olds, particularly because executive function skills are developing so quickly during this time. If we could go to the next slide. I love the analogy of the sturdy bridge. So I looked for a picture of a bridge that was the antithesis of what we're talking about. In this bridge, it's a little scary. That child is out there by himself on that bridge. So for the sturdy bridge to work, it needs to have a good foundation before kindergarten and a good foundation afterwards. It really could not be more important. We did some evaluations of pre-K programs at the Families and Work Institute a number of years ago, and we found that if the good work that was happening in pre-K kindergarten, pre-K programs wasn't continued into the early grades, those benefits would begin to drop off. And so that sturdy bridge needs to be really sturdy and have a good sturdy land on both sides. And if we can move to the next slide. I wanted this picture because it's of 7th graders. And it makes a very important point that I think we can see physically when we look at the differences among a normally developing 7th grade kids. If you took all the kids who were, I'm going to say, born on February 21st, that's my grandson's birthday, and you line them all up, you would see this kind of difference. That's normal. And we somehow or other have this conception that if kids are born in a certain year, they're in kindergarten, they're all going to be the same. They are not going to be the same, both in terms of their own biological development, and they're not going to be the same in terms of the background and experiences they've had. So if we could see it differently, if we could understand that this range of differences is normal and expected, and we could think about schools being ready for all of these differences versus just getting the kids ready for school, we would be in a whole different situation. And if we could move to the next slide. I think that there are 2 things. We talked about what undervalues kindergarten, and it is a transitional year, and transitions in development that are both biological and cultural tend to be the time when change is the most possible. And I think there are 2 things that we've got to be very wary of. The first is the readiness culture. I remember when the first President Bush announced this goals for education, and the first was having, this is 1990, and having kids ready for school. And that's become our mantra, and it's a very good policy mantra, but like all things, it has its downside. And the readiness culture means that we don't let 3-year-olds be 3-year-olds or 5-year-olds be 5-year-olds. We focus on always getting them ready for the next year. And so kindergarten can become the new 1st grade or even the 2nd grade when we really don't understand the science of learning and how important that is. And then I think that in the very real, whether we're in the post-pandemic or not, but the culture that is around learning loss is really both, it's a benefit, and we can see that there have been losses from the pandemic year. But if we focus on kids as deficits, what they've lost, that they can't do math, that they can't read, and we think we have to fix that by doing more drill and practice and those sorts of things, we're going to be in big trouble. We need to focus on kids as for their age and what they're developmentally, I think of it as developmentally necessary rather than developmentally appropriate. And we need to focus on what their strengths are as we work to build the things that they're not as good at. So we've been talking about kindergarten since I've been in the field of education. I do think, though, that the pandemic in the positive sense has made us rethink what we're doing, that we can't just be doing more of the same. It didn't work then, and it's not going to work now. Over to you, Ryan.
Thank you, Ellen. And yeah, same question to you, Ryan. I before you jump in, I do want to just note that moving away from readiness and definite deficits sounds like one very important part of the kindergarten transformation. So look forward to, I know you'll be talking a little bit about that as well. So take it away, Ryan.
Yeah. Thank you, Laura, and thank you, Ellen, Swati, and all of the wonderful folks that have decided to join us this afternoon. Yeah, I think we can go to the next slide. This is a very interesting question, and why is kindergarten such a pivotal year? I think from just piggybacking on some of what Ellen has shared, and we can go to the next slide, I'm sorry. I've included these lists of scientists. Ellen talked a little bit about some of the work that she's doing in the executive function space. I very much live in that space as well. In terms of early language and literacy, we can go to the next slide. And these are the scientists here that inform our work. But getting to the answer of this question about why kindergarten is such a pivotal year, Swati mentioned in her opening that kindergarten is the first global access point. And I think that's really important to remember. We know that development is so complex and it happens in context, right? Children are not developing in a vacuum. And so when we think about what are all the different inputs, what are the different environmental inputs beyond much of what we talk about in our work is this connection between caregiver and child and healthy early brain development. I had the pleasure of hearing Jack Shonkoff talk recently, a professor of pediatrics at Harvard and a researcher, and he talked really eloquently about moving from 1.0 to 2.0. And he talked about 1.0 being relationships and healthy early brain development as the foundation, and 2.0 being much of what we're talking about today, considering a child developing in this full ecosystem and all of the inputs that really make a difference for development. Even he talked about physiological health and even beyond healthy early brain development and the criticalness there, but also this realization of a full ecosystem. Can we go to the next slide? And so what we know is that kindergarten is a really pivotal year for what we like to talk about at the Rollins Center and the Atlanta Speech School is deep reading brain construction. So we're thinking about this continuum. It's already been talked about from the third trimester of pregnancy when a baby's auditory channel comes online. It's that early sound awareness that they're hearing their mother's voice, their caregiver's voice, even while they're still in utero. It's that early sound development that really lays the foundation for connecting speech sounds to print. And so it really is this continuum that we must recognize from the third trimester all the way through literacy. Our NAEP data came out yesterday, more detailed NAEP data. And so we like to talk about birth through literacy or prenatal through literacy, because we know that many children are not achieving literate language by 3rd or 4th grade. And so we've got to extend that continuum, as Ellen talked about, thinking about that bridge far beyond kindergarten, and in some cases, even into elementary and secondary school. So positive caregiver-child relationships still central. Ongoing incidental language rehearsal is what some researchers talk about, and play, as well as intentional interaction. So this is all really critical, right, in the first 5 years of life, but also beyond. Goldie Muhammad and Dr. Marianne Wolf sort of characterize or help characterize our thinking around what we're after for all kids, this deep reading brain construction. It is beyond proficient reading, beyond literal comprehension, but being able to read information and filter it and critically think about the information that you've read, connect with the characters in the story, and be able to read for identity. Goldie Muhammad talks about this as reading and writing as transformative acts of self and society. So this is, I think, the shared interest that we have here in seeking a life of self-determination for all of our kids. We can go to the next slide. And so we're kindred spirits here with Ellen and others who are very focused on the executive function. We know that kindergarten is a critical developmental year for oral language literacy and executive function. And so Ellen talked about this, executive function skills being all of these broadly defined as cognitive flexibility, inhibitory control, and working memory, but they manifest as these specific skills: the ability to pay attention, to plan, to organize, to regulate your emotions and behavior, and to self-monitor. Kindergarten is an important year for this development. And we know much research shows us that at this point, that language and executive function skills are inextricably tied. Children who are struggling with oral language tend to also be struggling with executive function skills. And so it is executive function skills that really undergird language in all learning. Can we go to the next slide? And I wanted to include this because, again, the space that we really live in is language and literacy, and thinking about executive function undergirding all of these skills. Well, kindergarten is a really critical year for the development of all of these language comprehension skills and word reading skills. In many instances, it's the children's first introduction to formal instruction. Even though we know, as has already been mentioned, that many of these language comprehension strands, background knowledge, vocabulary, a child's understanding of syntax and morphology, their verbal reasoning, their understanding or their literacy knowledge, they come to school with some of this already, right? And I know we could have discussions for days about what we want kids to come with, but I am in solidarity with my colleagues that we must approach all kids, all families from a real strengths-based place, realizing that children come to us at different spots along the continuum. Can we go to the next slide? Oh, I'm sorry, that's it for this question.
Great, thank you, Ryan and Ellen. And we've heard a lot, you just mentioned it again, Ryan, around meeting children where they are, taking a strength-based approach. We know children come to school with a lot of diverse experiences and families. Some come with pre-K, others have attended Head Start, others, have attended maybe family childcare or coming directly from home. And we still hear a lot of emphasis on readiness, getting families ready and having families work on certain specific skills with children to get them ready for kindergarten. But as we've heard, we need to move more to what do educators and schools and states need to do to make sure systems and they are ready to receive children. And so particularly during this transitional year, what would you say educators, schools, systems need to do to receive children during this year, to really meet children and families where they are. And Ellen, let's start with you.
Okay, thank you. If we could go to the next slide, please. That's my cute grandson. He is with me in every presentation. He's a lot bigger now, but I have this slide of him because I'd come back from a trip and brought him an airplane, and you can see how totally engaged he is. And I think when we think about learning, we have to think about engagement, because unless you're paying attention to something, unless you're engaged in it, you're not really going to learn it. And it's something that I probably have been focused on because I've worked a lot with the business community, and they know that they measure, in fact, productivity by looking at employee engagement. If we could go to the next slide. I began to see as early as 25 years or so ago, more anecdotally, that too many older children were not engaged in learning. You have that rapt attention of Zay when he was looking at the airplane, and then you move to kids who begin to increasingly not just drop out of school, but drop out of caring, drop out of being engaged. So if you go to the next slide, I had the opportunity in a study that I've done for my forthcoming book to look at engagement, to look at it before the pandemic and during the pandemic. So these two data points were 9 months apart. And we look at engagement in terms of being involved, caring about, being really connected to what it is you're learning, paying attention to it, and those sorts of things. And in 2019, you can see there that only 19% are very engaged. But if you look at engaged and very engaged, it only goes to 57%. And I don't think having just half the kids engaged in learning is really, and this is a nationally representative sample, is really enough. These are 9 through 19-year-olds. But during the pandemic, that dropped down to 33%. And so it's always a moment in time, and it can come back up again. But we need to start with engagement. If you go to the next slide, please. So why does engagement matter? If you go to the next slide. Studies find, and this is a lot of people, but I'll focus on Jennifer Frederick's work. She's found that when young people are engaged, they're more motivated, they have higher grades, they're more likely to stay in school, they're more likely to go to college, and they're also more likely to have positive relationships with other kids and less likely to get into trouble or be depressed. So engagement is both cognitively, socially, emotionally important for thriving now and in the future. We could go to the next slide. So I began in 2001 going to the science, like Ryan talked about. If you, and these are the early childhood researchers whom I and my Mind in the Making team have interviewed and filmed. And if you could go to the next slide. We have moved up into adolescence. And so these are 9 through 19-year-old researchers who look at 9 through 19-year-olds, because I think understanding the origins of things, where things are going, where they're leading to, where they're coming from is really important. So these are the researchers who we have interviewed and in many cases filmed. If you go to the next slide. So what did I find? Next slide, please. When I would look at the research, I could see that even though it might be about, in this case, understanding that other people can think different things than you think, it is really about so much more. This is a study of Alison Gopnik. It's an older study. That box of crayons, she shows it to kids all closed up, and it has pictures of crayons on the box. And she says to the, let's say, 4-year-olds, 5-year-olds, 3-year-olds, what do you think's inside of that box? And most kids will say, yeah, crayons, you know. And then she'll open it up, or the experimental will open it up and show that no, there are actually paper clips inside of that box. And then she says, so what do you think your friend over there, your friend in the childcare program, is going to think inside of that box? And some kids will say, well, they'll think the paper clips are in the box. In other words, what I know is what you must know. It's called the curse of knowledge. We think that other people know what we know. And other kids will recognize that even though they know that there are paper clips inside, most kids, when it's all closed up and they don't know what's inside, will think that there are crayons inside. What that study shows is perspective taking, which I think of as a life skill, but behind that is executive function. The kids are having to remember the rules. They're having to remember that the question is, what does your friend think is inside of that box? They're having to think flexibly, cognitive flexibility. What would I think? What would someone else think? They can't go on automatic, inhibitory control. Ryan talked about those characteristics, and they have to be reflective and think about their own thinking. And so those are the skills in that experiment that are being developed. And I was seeing that in as I began to look at the research in the studies that show that children are thriving, and having perspective of other people helps you thrive in school, because you know what the teacher expects, and you know what other adults, what your parents expect, or what the other kids expect. It also relies on executive function. It's foundational to all learning. If you go to the next slide now. And this is another experiment, and it's research of Stephanie Carlson. And that child came to her lab and picked a toy that he wanted, and then was asked to put it in a box and to lock it with a key. And then he did a number of games with the researcher. And when the games were over, he was asked to, here are the keys, unlock the box. Well, unbeknownst to the child, none of the keys work. So the challenge is, how does a child do something that's really hard? Keep trying keys. How long does that child persist? If you notice, that child has on a cape, because in the experiment, the child was asked, and there are 3 different conditions: be yourself, and then, or think of yourself in the second person. Think of, what would Brian do? Or pretend to be someone else. And in this case, he pretended to be Superman. When the child pretended, he was able to persist at an impossible task. Almost a year, he gained a year in development. Pretending is not just play. And I really want to make that point. Pretending is really critical to learning, to being able to take on challenges, and learning involves taking on hard things. You can see again that executive functions matter, that it's remembering the rules, it's thinking flexibly, you're not going on automatic, you keep trying things, and you're reflecting, well, if this key doesn't work, does that key work? So all of those are important in all of the research that I was seeing. If you could go on now. Yes, this is Phil Zalazzo's work, also at the University of Minnesota, and he's measuring executive function directly. You can see it physically. They also have it on an iPad. The task for the child is to look at the picture, and that picture might have a star or a truck on it, and the truck might, or the star might be blue or might be red. And first you're told to match by shape. So if it's a star, put it in the box to my left. If it's a truck, put it in the box to my right. But then they switch and say, now you'll match by color. So if it's blue, put it in the box with the blue on it. And if it's red, put it in the box with the red on it. And that's really hard to do. And that again is looking at executive function. What's important about that? So you're remembering the rules, you're thinking flexibly, you're reflecting, and you're paying attention, and you're not going on automatic. And those are the core aspects of this foundational aspect to all learning. That's intentional, that is goal directed, that is problem solving, and that is how you measure it. What's important in that particular experiment is, rather when the kids made a mistake, instead of saying, oops, you got it wrong, next one, or telling the answer, the researchers asked that child and the kids in the experiment to reflect on why they made the mistake. What were they thinking? And when they reflect, there's an actual brain change, and they also are more likely to do it correctly. So again, teaching that doesn't tell children what to do or what the right answer is, but helping children reflect on I see that Deb Leong is on this call. She would call it the tools of your mind. The tools that you're using to learn is critical to all learning. So let's go on to the next slide. This is, go back. Yeah, executive functions make it possible, I've said, to think flexibly, to call in your working memory so that you can solve problems, to use inhibitory control so you don't go automatic, and to reflect. And people don't usually think of reflecting, but it's really critical. Go on to the next slide. There's so many studies that show that, and I'm quoting Adele Diamond and Daphne Ling in their review of hundreds of studies of executive function, that it's predictive of achievement, health, wealth, and quality of life, more important than IQ and socioeconomic status. So I think if we're going to think differently, and I think we need to think differently, and hopefully the pandemic will cause us to, we need to think about promoting executive function skills, not just math and literacy. They're important for school readiness and school success. If you go to the next slide, then please. They're also important for life success throughout the school years. They're more important in getting a job and keeping a job and advancing in your job, at your friends, at good social relationships, at even preventing negative things like staying out of jail and resisting substance abuse, and happier and better quality of life. These are, again, quotes because this is Adele Diamond and Daphne Ling's words in quoting a number of studies here. So if you go ahead now, please. So since whoa, how did that typo get in there? Speaking of not executive functions. Anyway, sorry about that, but we'll correct it next time. What I did was to look at the research that Diamond and Ling pulled together, numbers of studies that show that if you're just training for one skill, if you're just trying to promote, if you have a program just to promote working memory or thinking flexibly or using self-control, it doesn't tend to lead to far transfer. There's a lot of hype about brain games and those sorts of things, but these really need to be embedded into the curriculum. So working with Deb and Phil Zalazzo and my own experience, we came up with a series of principles to promote executive function skills. Let's go through them. Okay. The first is goal-directed whole person approach. And I say a whole person approach because it's informed by the science of knowledge. It is positive. It brings together social and emotional and cognitive capacities, not just SEL over here and cognitive over here. That's part of the reframe. We need to put them together where they belong because that's how the brain works. And this will help both kids and adolescents become self-directed, engaged learners. Let's go on. Number 2 goal. And I have questions that we can share with you about how to look for programs that have this, because you're going to need to see these embedded in programs. Do the people who run this program believe in the program and believe and care about the children? Do they see them positively? Do they see them as deficits or as learning losses, but do they see them in terms of their strengths and what they can build on to improve and thrive? Let's go on. The third is creating a community of learners. We don't learn alone. That child on the bridge is wrong. We only learn through relationships, through each other. And so the people who are facilitating the program need to be ongoing learners, and they need to help them see their role as helping children learn. Their role isn't to teach. That's wrong. Their role is to promote or facilitate learning. If you teach, you give information to an empty vessel. If you facilitate learning, you help create environments and situations where children maintain that engagement and learning. And they serve as role models in doing this. Let's go on to principle 4. They meet the needs of all. And this is really an important point. If you don't feel safe, if you don't feel you belong, you're not going to learn. These are not nice to haves. These are must haves. We have psychological needs. Ryan talked about self-determination theory. I think that we have 5 important basic needs. And if we're not meeting those needs for respect, for autonomy, for challenge, for identity, for purpose, and we're not promoting positive mindsets, the children are not going to thrive. So that's important too. Next principle, please. the environment needs to be relevant and challenging. It needs to be meaningful. The activities are meaningful. They're real world. They're not just drill and practice off in some remote thing where kids are wondering, why am I doing this? But you're using math, you're using reading, you're using science in a part to answer your questions, to learn about the world and how it works. And you're taxing executive function skills in new and different ways. That's how executive function skills, and that's how content knowledge is learned. Go on to the last principle. Reflection. Well, it's the next to last, sorry. Activities are structured so that kids have an opportunity to step back and think about what they're learning, to reflect on it. Why did they make a mistake? We all need to make mistakes to learn, and we need to improve those. Let's go on. And the seventh one is well-being. Unless we're prioritizing well-being, kids are not going to learn. The program, its people, its activities all promote well-being and joy, and they reduce feelings of stress. Kindergarten should not be the new stressful place. It should be a place where learning is joyful, hard, challenging, yes, but also joyful. Not a place of loneliness, but a place where we can feel self-confident, where we can feel pride, and where we can feel compassion for everyone else.
Thank you, Ellen. Ryan, same question to you, but in addition to talking about what teachers, schools, and systems can be doing differently, can you also add to that what kinds of supports teachers need to meet children's needs during the kindergarten year?
Sure, absolutely. Thank you, Laura. And thank you, Ellen, for that very enlightening and certainly a lot to reflect on in what you shared. I think, this discussion around connection over compliance, someone mentioned it in the chat, the confusion between whether students are truly engaged or whether they're being compliant. I think this is, to Ellen's point, very central, foundational, Ellen, as you called it, a must-have to the learning process. Students must feel that they are safe and that they can trust the adults in their environment. We can go to the next slide. I think one of the ways that we can achieve this is by recognizing, connecting with students, realizing that they bring with them many strengths to the classroom. For one, a strong grasp of their first language or dialect. We know that between 0 to 5, that children are developing language in context. We are not explicitly teaching them, for example, in my native language of English, we are not explicitly teaching them subject, verb, object, right? They are learning this language in their environment. They've got a really strong phonology or sound system. They understand the rules of language, the rules that govern sentence construction, the rules that govern the makeup of words. So this is really central to a strength that kids bring with them to the classroom. Now, I'm a speech language pathologist by original training, and so it is true that children come with varying levels of ability, but speaking on the whole. Also, children bring with them in many instances a strong sense of their identity. And this identity is shaped by their culture, their experience, their values. And so as we think about laying that fertile soil for learning when children enter kindergarten, what does that look like? That looks like spending time getting into relationships with the kids you serve, but also getting into relationships with their families so that we can understand what is the family's values of literacy. Goldie Muhammad talks about literacies beyond in the Western sense of literate language or reading and writing, but what are all the ways in which a family values learning? These are critical for us to understand as educators, as systems, as leaders. And also a strength that children bring with them is enthusiasm for connection and for learning. Once kids, I have a 6-year-old and I have an 18-month-old. Once kids get over that initial shock of, oh my gosh, my caregivers are leaving me somewhere with these strange people. After a couple of days, right, they're thrilled, they're excited, they show up, they're joyful, they're bouncing, they can't wait to see their teachers and their friends. they are yearning for connection. And when we think about healthy early brain development and language and how our brain works, our brains are wired for that connection, wired for communication, and wired for oral language. Kindergarten, it provides an opportunity, a first real formal opportunity if children have not attended pre-K or preschool, to show what they know and to show what they don't know. So kindergarten in many instances becomes makes it evident sometimes because children are with what we would describe as typically developing peers, that maybe they're experiencing some protracted development in the areas of language and learning. We also know that children with developmental language delay and learning disabilities will also have some difficulty with executive functioning. And we can go to the next slide. Ellen talked about these skills, problem solving, planning, self-reflection, working memory, and self-talk. I really want to underscore and drive home the point that many of these skills require language abilities. In order to engage in self-talk, you must have language to engage in self-talk. In order to engage in thought and self-reflection, you really must have the language skills to do that. I'm sorry, can we go back to the previous slide for 1 second? I put this rope on the slide because in the theme of Bridge and Scarborough's reading rope, a reading framework that undergirds a lot of the work that we do around the science of reading and structured literacy, this frayed rope illustrates that there are, in spite of all the strengths that children will bring with them, and they will, and I also encourage educators, if you're having a challenge thinking about the strengths that your kids bring, do some research, do some digging, even if you need to write them down, because you need to hold those strengths in mind as you're learning about kids. But this rope illustrates that some of these strands around healthy or around language development, around executive function and early literacy may be a little frayed. And now we can go to the next slide. Because all of this is so closely related. And I think COVID is a case in point of this. The cumulative risk theory or framework, though it is very flawed, many researchers and scholars have pointed that out, but the overall idea of cumulative risk is that developmental and achievement outcomes are negatively related to risk factors. So the more risk factors a child has in their life, and those risk factors can be being reared in lower socioeconomic status backgrounds or economically disadvantaged backgrounds, mobility, trauma, prolonged stress, all of these are risk factors. And we know that these risk factors negatively impact overall child development and outcomes. And this is critical for us to understand, but certainly not to perseverate on it. Can we go to the next slide? And I have the risk factors included here. One thing we know from neuroscience is that differences in structural brain development have been observed as young as infancy. So this just illustrates the point that early environments matter for children, especially as Swati noted, that kindergarten for many children can be that first entry point into formal schooling. Can we go to the next slide? But I think what the question is around what can we do as a community of educators? What can we do as a community of leaders to be able to support all kids? So even in spite of the flaws that the cumulative risk approach or framework has, what we do know is that there are several promotive and protective factors. So if you think back to that earlier slide that I shared around the ecosystem, sometimes as educators and systems leaders, we can get overwhelmed and bogged down, realizing that how could I possibly influence this entire ecosystem, right? And so we hear people talking about kids coming to school not having had a good night's rest, or not having had meals, or growing up in traumatic and prolonged stress environments. How can we possibly overcome these things? Well, we know that from this research, there are certain promotive and protective factors that can support a child's learning. And one of those, or two of those that I want to highlight, are teacher-child closeness. So again, underscoring the importance of those relationships, getting into relationships with the kids that you serve, getting into relationships with their families. So often in the work that I've been a part of, looking at linguistic differences and how linguistic differences impact learning, impact speech language impairment or reading disability, we often talk about school versus home. But it's important to remember that schools are in many instances an extension of the community. School and home are not always completely separate. And so what I want to really have as a take-home message for y'all is that it is our responsibility to do all that we can to get into relationship with the families and kids that we serve. And so there's some repairing to do around that, especially after the pandemic. Some families, are we welcome? What is the school culture? What is the environment? We've got to create a real open door policy and a welcome feel for families. Also, high quality teaching. And this is something that I can talk about very briefly on the next slide. We need systems that work for all families and for all kids. I also want to underscore that point too, that we talk about what can be done, what do we need to do? We do need to realize that there are a lot of systemic challenges that families are facing. And that's, yes, we know that there are certain families and communities, demographics that have been disproportionately impacted, for example, by COVID, but other public health crises. And we have to remember that we can't place the burden on the people that we're trying to serve, that we have to take some of that responsibility. And as Ellen said, and Swati said, and Laura said in the beginning of this, getting our systems, our school systems, our classrooms, getting ready for kids. And so we talk about this work at the Rollins Center in the Atlanta Speech School on this and Cox campus on this wheel. What are all the things that need to happen? And I am specifically talking about language and the development of literacy, not neglecting executive function here, thinking about how executive function or how the development of language and reading will serve executive function. And so we talk about what are all those things that need to be in place. High quality professional learning, high quality instructional coaching, culturally and responsive practices and materials, a evidence-based, science-aligned core reading program. We're not talking about structured literacy and the science of reading today, but what we do know, much research has showed us, even if we go back to the work of the National Reading Panel, that we are not teaching reading in the way that the brain learns to read. And this is of no fault of teachers. We realize that teachers also, Swati mentioned in the beginning, needing to connect practice or knowledge to practice. And so many teachers that are responsible for teaching our children need more professional learning support. Data and assessment is also critical, understanding where children are, and also MTSS in response to intervention. Ensuring that our instruction follows this tiered approach so that we are grabbing kids early that show some risk factors for later language and learning challenges and pulling them in, putting them in these intensive intervention paradigms, progress monitoring them to ensure that they are learning. And if not, making a referral. The last thing that I'll say, because I think this is my last slide here, that I want to underscore is that oral language, I mentioned, develops in context, 0 to 5. So in early development, language drives reading, language drives literacy, and we could say executive function and language are driving the development of reading, writing, and spelling, mathematics, all of these areas. In later development, though, it is reading that drives more sophisticated development of oral language and the ability to hone and continue to build some of these executive function skills that Ellen talked so eloquently about, that in order to be able to take the perspectives of others, in order to think critically, in order to plan, problem solve, language is so central to these skills. And I think that is it, Laura, for this section.
Yeah, thank you, Ryan. I think we'll come back to talk a little bit more about teachers later, but let's bring down slides. And both you and Ellen gave us so much to think about, and I really love the panel's focus on meeting children and families where they are and thinking about what we have to do to teach them in the ways that they're going to learn best and really, really thrive. Swati, I want to come back to you and just in thinking about resources that are available to really do some of the things that Ellen and Ryan have talked about. I know that the Department of HHS has launched a new round of preschool development grants, and those applications, state applications, are due November 7th. States can apply and for either a renewal or a planning. And while PDG is focused primarily birth to 5, there is discussion in the grant around transition into kindergarten and early learning continuum birth to 8. So could you just talk about how state leaders can use PDG to improve children's learning experiences and environments in kindergarten?
Sure, happy to. You're absolutely correct, Laura, that while the name of the grant, Preschool Development Grant Birth to 5, which is the core focus, it's a systems building grant. And the idea behind it, and the Department of Education and Health and Human Services works very closely together. And we had lots of great conversations about the continuity of relationships and the shared professional development that really needs to happen across these disparate sectors to provide a seamless early learning experience. And so, as you noted in the grant itself, the importance of the transition to kindergarten is there, as well as thinking about instruction and aligned instructional strategies. I think Ryan pointed to some of the work that needs to be done there, and Ellen did as well. The Preschool Development Grant is just one of the federal grants that can support this work. When ESSA was passed, there was, various documents that were issued during the Obama administration looking at how early learning is allowable and can be permitted with funds that go to SEAs and to school districts. So an example I think that is often overlooked is Title I funding. And at a time where schools have more resources than they have had in quite a long time, the chance to partner, Title I can serve children in early learning. You can use it to expand preschool program and services. It can support family engagement, and it has to meet Head Start performance standards for education. And so again, it's that HHS Department of Education connection. And so whether we're talking about data, diagnostic, and tools, or how you can blend and braid funding, are all of the different levels of governance, of federal, state, local, and working with community-based partners and parents has got to come together to knit these pieces together. And I'll say, as far as the federal government is concerned, we really have to understand better on the ground what we can do to make those funding streams work better together. I know it's really not easy, and I've had a chance to see that up close, and we're really interested in understanding what are the elements that make it work more seamlessly.
Yeah, no, I think that that's great, that that's something that is on your radar, and helping those different funding streams to work together more effectively will enable some good work at the state level as they leverage those federal resources. And I'll just add a quick plug for a toolkit that New America and my colleagues at Ed Council recently released on policies to enable more effective transitions into kindergarten. We have a section on the many funding streams that PDG, Title I, and IDEA and others that have language around transition and many of the other areas that we're talking about today, and how states can use those to enable some of this work. Okay, one more question from me, and then we're going to take some audience questions. So we know yesterday, I feel that we have to just at least briefly reflect on the NAEP scores that came out yesterday for 4th and 8th graders, but we can think more about 4th graders, in our comments here today. But really what I want to hear from you is what's the most important takeaway, and what do you think are the most important things that schools and educators should be doing to address the interrupted relearning that we know has exacerbated by COVID, and then drops in the most recent NAEP scores, in elementary schools? What can they do? And, what's the big takeaway for kindergarten? Easy question. Who wants to start?
I can start us on that question. So I actually reached out to one of my colleagues this morning who does a lot of statistics, because I wanted to understand if you just look at the first graph that NAEP lists, it shows I think a 3-point decline from 2019 to now. I could be misquoting, but I think it's about 3 points. And I think for me, one of the major takeaways, without being too technical, is that if you look at the trends since 2015, we are experiencing the trend line. You can see the trend line decreasing slightly. And so I think about what this means in terms of like practical terms, and how many kids, or what percentage of kids in our country at 4th grade are reading proficiently based on the NAEP standards. And I think that while COVID certainly had a profound impact beyond education, just thinking about societally what families have experienced, the trauma that our children have experienced, our economy, deaths. I mean, the pandemic has really wreaked havoc on our country. And of course, those from lower socioeconomic status backgrounds, folks who identify as Black or African American, and other global majority people have been disproportionately impacted. I think what's really critical to think about, though, is that COVID impacted us, but we were not doing really well before COVID. Many children, majority of children in our country, were struggling with reading or had not achieved reading proficiency by 4th grade. And so I think for me, the major take-home message is that COVID impacted us. And I certainly don't want to take anything away from some of the incremental gains that we were seeing even pre-2015. I think what we should be focusing on, and not spending a whole lot of time over analyzing the data, but thinking about where kids were before COVID, where kids are now, and what is it going to take? What do our teachers need? What do our district leaders need to be able to move the needle? And I think in the space that I live in, realizing that language and executive function really just lays the foundation for all learning, we need to spend time being extremely intentional about building skills. I'm not talking about skill and drill, and I'm not talking about, compliant classrooms. I'm talking about really intentional, explicit, systematic instruction for kids. So I guess for me, the concern that I've sort of had around the pandemic and the data is that I don't want families to be misled, thinking that majority of kids in our country were reading and now they're not because of COVID. I think I want families and everyone to know, I mean, I think we do, that we were struggling pre-COVID and COVID has impacted that. But we need to really focus on moving the needle for all kids at this point.
Thanks, Ryan. No, you
And
raised.
supporting teachers to do that. Very clear about that. That as we think about implementing new programs, new initiatives, new supports, or new resources for teachers, they have got to have that support around implementation.
Thanks for making that point. Ellen, Swati, do you have anything that you want to add? 1 minute.
Right now, we also have the potential of seeing a bigger divide between teachers and parents. That the pandemic made it clear that parents are central to children's learning. All of those photographs of Zoom meetings with kids in them, I don't know if we needed any more indication, but the politicization of parents versus teachers, I think, is something that we're going to have to address. And so if I was going to wave a magic wand, I would have communities get together and think of one thing that they did that worked or learned about learning during the pandemic that they would like to see implemented in their community, in their school, in their program, so that we start with what works. We bring teachers and families together to create a North Star and try to bridge the divide that I'm afraid is being ripped apart a bit by politics, and bringing people together to start with, let's use this as an opportunity to make change. A crisis is a terrible thing to waste.
Thanks, Ellen. Okay. Let's jump to a question from the audience. So Randy Ross has a question. He says, I'm very interested in the question of identity and how it develops, particularly racial and ethnic identity. What role does kindergarten in particular play in the positive development of racial and ethnic development? And how can we help white educators work on this when they are often not even aware of their own racial identity?
I can start with this one because through the Hunt Institute and a group of funders, we pulled together parents, school leaders, and policymakers to talk about this question during the pandemic. And first of all, there's not very much research on the development of identity in young children. It starts with older kids. If you look at ethnic and racial identity, most of the research starts with older children, although I think it's a developmental, it's a basic need to develop a sense of identity from the earliest times on. So we can do that by, first of all, I think stories are how young children, one of the major ways that young children learn about who they are. And so encouraging families to tell family stories with pride about who they are is really important. To pretend that we're colorblind is not viable, that we're not colorblind. Kids are picking up clues of who's in, who's out from the very beginning, about gender, about race, about ethnicity, about all aspects of their being. And I think we need to think as educators I think differently as educators. We need to think about, here are a set of basic needs that children have to develop a positive sense of identity, to learn to feel competent, but also to deal with challenge, to have some autonomy, but be treated with respect, to have support and feel that they're safe and belonging. Those are some of the, and to find ways to contribute or give back, not just to get, but to give back. I think those are, and toward a sense of what's meaningful. Those are basic needs I think we have. And so we as adults need to be responsible for thinking about, how does our environment promote those basic needs? Just like we make sure that kids have food and shelter and water, we need to make sure that they have psychologically, have the psychological basic needs met. So I think that that's going to be a coming push in education, where we think about this, not because belonging has been, oh, that's nice, but it's you know, reading, writing, relating, the fourth R in a sense. We need to make sure that we're thinking about meeting basic needs, because there's just 30, 40 years of evidence that shows that people don't thrive unless these basic psychological needs are met.
And I can just add very quickly, y'all see at this point, I'm certainly a one-trick pony on language. I want to read something that I just pulled up really quickly from Toni Morrison about this question of identity development, because in the work that I've done as a speech language pathologist and researcher on the connection between language and literacy, this point is very clear to me from Toni Morrison. She says, it is terrible to think that a child with 5 different present tenses comes to school to be faced with books that are less than his own language, and then to be told things about this language, which is him, that are sometimes permanently damaging. This is a really cruel fallout of racism. And so Toni Morrison talks about the connection between language and identity, and how this connection is so critical from early on. And so if we think about what can we do, back to the point of connection and not compliance, you don't show up at school and you must speak the Queen's English now. Well, it does not work like that. We want you to be versed in academic English so that you can learn to read, but we must consider that your language is your identity. And when we tell you things about your language, we are telling you that something is wrong with you, or something is wrong with your community, something is wrong with your parents. That's where you've learned language. And so what we must do, again, back to like tangible recommendations, as you think about what are the strengths of the population that I serve. If you can't think of any, figure it out. Go to get in relationship with your families, read research about the communities that you serve, because I think that's really the goal. And as Ellen talks about this fertile soil, we can create this fertile soil by getting into relationship, but it's going to be hard for me to get into relationship with you. Even if you're my teacher, if I feel like you don't value who I am and what I bring to the classroom.
Can I quote? I want to quote Toni Morrison too. She lived in the neighborhood where I live, so I don't know whether she said this or whether I've read it, but she said that children are looking to see whether our eyes light up when we see them. I've never forgotten that. They are looking.
I'd love to just add that if with the focus of this time we've spent together, if we in fact really did make kindergarten the sturdy bridge it could be, we wouldn't accomplish that until we did the pieces of the puzzle and really thought about implementing those practices that both Ryan and Ellen talked about. This isn't simple. It is pretty complicated, but it would create a shift in engagement, a shift in classroom practice, a shift in the set of relationships that would have to come together. And so I do see a focus on kindergarten as an opportunity to have an equity agenda.
Thank you to all of you. We have so many great questions coming in, and it's making me happy that we have more sessions that will touch on some of what was raised, but or some of the questions that have come in, but also I will get with, or we'll get together the presenters and see if we are able to put out some answers to these questions that can go out in the materials that the campaign will send out after this webinar. But I hope you'll join me in thanking Swati, Ryan, and Ellen, and thanks to all of you for attending today, and I will turn it over to Hillary.
Perfect. Thank you, Laura, and thank you, Ryan, Swati, Ellen, for your time, for all your thoughts, and for the energy that you've brought to this conversation. Such an important time. To everybody, all our participants, please take a moment, fill out our survey poll, let us know what you're thinking, what we did, and please consider joining us for one of the upcoming webinars, whether it's one of our regular Learning Tuesdays, or of course, be on the lookout for the remaining series in this, or the remaining parts in this series. We have about one a month coming up in November and December. And so please be on the lookout, join us for the ongoing conversation, and find places to get your questions about kindergarten and readiness and the importance of that stage answered. And so thank you all, and we will hope you have a wonderful afternoon.